Dantzel Sherry is the author of over 20 published short stories and novelettes. She started writing in college but decided she needed to push herself, so she signed up for a writer's boot camp facilitated by Orson Scott Card, where she learned about the short story market. It was through writing short stories that she developed her own voice and learned to tell compact, heartfelt stories that get people excited and make people laugh. Dantzel's learned a lot in the intervening years, and I'm excited to have her on the show to share about her journey and what's ahead. Hello, and welcome to the Fearless Storyteller podcast. I'm your host, Ethan Freckleton. Have you ever noticed how fear stops us from creating and sharing our best work? Join the Fearless Storyteller as we explore the heart and soul of writing stories, songs, and scripts that sell with the people who write them. Each guest has their own unique hero's journey and insights into the intersections between limiting beliefs and success. If you're enjoying this podcast, be sure to leave a review on your favorite podcatcher of choice. Also, be sure to check out the show notes for a link to the Patreon offerings. We've got some good ones for you. Thanks so much for being a listener and supporter of the show. Enjoy today's interview. Dantzel Cherry, welcome to the Fearless Storyteller podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So what do we need to know about you, Dantzel?
Well, I guess it's good to know that I am a short story writer. I've had stories out in Galaxy's Edge and Fireside and Escape Pod, places like that. And I'm currently working on some novels, but that's kind of where I began, and I just have a deep love for short fiction. So yeah, that's my writing background. I've been writing for seriously for about 10 years. Told myself I was going to write, my whole life, and I finally got down and got buckled in and really started doing it 10 years ago. So
And when did you not seriously start writing?
I have loved writing since I was a kid. And I always thought, people would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I said, I want to be a dance teacher and a lawyer and a writer. And I was actually just talking about this with somebody the other day. I said, I teach Pilates and some dance still, and I write, and I'm really good at arguing. So I kind of covered all the bases.
Right.
So I've kind of done it ever since then. I kind of dabbled in writing, and I felt like I was, I had skills as a writer, but I didn't really start writing as many stories as I would have liked to until really, even though I did here and there, I really didn't start doing it until college. And I actually used college classes, my writing classes, as a way to make myself write. And it was when I was starting to, realize I had to have assignments. I had to do it. And that's so funny because I loved doing it, but I didn't do it. And now I'm realizing that's probably because of the ADHD. Yeah, I needed the structure at the time. And so it was really helpful to have the structure. And then partway through, when I had one more year left in college, and I'd been doing my creative writing classes and things like that, I said, I really need to push myself. I was learning some things in my classes, and that was great, but I really felt like I needed to try to do a little bit more. And so I looked for something that seemed like it would fit the time constraints that I was under. And so I did the Orson Scott Card Literary Boot Camp. So I sent in my paper, got into that class or into that boot camp, and got my butt kicked for a week and learned a lot of things about writing. And I learned more about short story markets and about so much more, that really wasn't being covered in my college classes. And, and so, I appreciate what I learned there, but that really was what kickstarted me taking things even more seriously and really pushing myself as a writer after that.
Yeah. So was that an in-person event, the boot camp?
It was, yeah. He was running it he had one in back on the East Coast, and then he actually, for a couple of years, had them in Utah. And so I was in Idaho at the time, and I traveled down and stayed with family and took it, and I really grew a lot from that experience.
Yeah, I bet you were really fired up after that.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's funny though, because there's so much that, we don't know that we don't know. And, and I didn't know about short story markets, and I didn't know, like I was trying to figure it out when I was in school, and I'd be like trying to look at the boards, and it's like you don't even know what to look for until somebody starts telling you, oh hey, you should go check out this place, or hey, this is a good magazine. So I knew about some of the short story markets. I knew about fantasy and science fiction, and I knew about I think Analog and Asimov's, and I'd come across the Intergalactic Medicine Show, and so I knew about those, and I really didn't know any others. It was really, I'd read a lot of novels, but I didn't know where to submit. If I was trying to submit novels at the time, if I had been doing that, I wouldn't have known where to submit those. So it was really helpful when I had done that. And then a couple years, about a year later, I moved to Texas and started going to the conventions in Texas and made friends there. And they said, oh, you should use Duotrope. And then, then there was an even better submission tracker called the Submissions Grinder, which is fantastic. And so I've been able to find so many more markets. But it's like, if you're talking with new writers, they don't know where to look. It's you don't know what you don't know until you find out otherwise. And so it's so rewarding to get to help other people, help them understand, things that they may not have even known what questions to ask until somebody was able to bring it to their attention.
Right. And so I know I'm not hugely familiar with doing short story as far as like vocationally.
Right.
I get the sense that there's a lot of research, or you'll want to align yourself with the types of publications that publish what you're interested in, right?
Right.
And you mentioned a few short story markets before you had attended Orson Scott Card's boot camp. Were you a reader of their magazines?
I was a little bit. I hadn't read as deeply of short fiction from short story from magazines. Of course, I read a lot of short fiction in college and in high school, and started to read some of it for fun from what I could find. But it was after that I found more markets. Now it's like it's so fun because there's Lightspeed and there's Clark's World, and every short story market has its own flavor, and that's awesome. That they don't all have the same thing, and you may be able to sell a story at Galaxy's Edge that other stories may think are, or other markets may, or that they may love the story, but like, it just doesn't fit our market. And so there's nothing wrong with the story itself. It's just it didn't fit their market. So there's definitely a lot of that to keep in mind if you are looking at short story markets. But yeah, there's a lot of great ones out there, and there's pretty much anything to suit anybody's taste. If they want short fiction, if they want slightly longer stories, that are going to take them an hour or two to read, there's. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you dropped for a second. Did you notice that you dropped on your end?
I did. I heard a silence. I wasn't sure what happened. I went, wait, where is
Well, what I can't tell right now is if are you wearing some sort of headset with battery or anything, or is it just?
I'm not. I'm on my laptop, and so I'm just talking directly into it.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There will be probably intermittent drops then. Just
Okay.
be alert to that, and there may be moments where we need to rewind a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah, cool. So we were talking about, those, jump. I hear you. What I'm picking up is you have a lot of passion and excitement still for the short story market. It seems like you have a lot of expertise and energy. And I'm wondering what it was about short stories in particular that drew your attention.
Uh, you know that, yeah, I think that's a good question to ask, because I know the advice used to be, well, if you want to be a writer, then start writing short stories, and then and then do novels, because then you can make your name as a short story writer. And that's really not the case anymore. It's very rare that somebody would make their name as a short story writer and then jump up. I mean, there's differences. Like Ken Liu's an amazing writer. He did a lot of short fiction and really did make his name that way before. But I would say for modern writers, you don't see that as much. A lot of people just jump right into novels. But for me, it was partly forced because of the classes I was writing in college. The professor, she didn't want me to write longer fiction. And I'd been trying to, take some stories a couple different ways and planning to do it a bigger thing. She's like, nope, keep your scope small. And ultimately, I think that was a good thing, because there's a lot of differences between short fiction and novel. There's a lot that's similar, but there's also some differences as far as the scope that you're thinking in a story that can be contained in 1,000 words or 4,500 words is very different from 100,000 words, obviously. And so for me, I was really glad that I was able to focus on short fiction, because for me it helped me to develop my voice more. I was able to play with different story styles, so that I have some that they're very dark, and there's some that are dark humor, and there's some that are just silly. And I can really play with the scope, and I can try out different things, and then I can send it out. I can send it to readers, I can send it to editors, and get the feedback, and have a shorter turnaround time, so that I can then build on it faster. And for me, that was great. And it's kind of now, because now I'm really feeling drawn towards wanting to do bigger projects. And so I'm working on a novel, and it's hard to work on a novel and work on the short story ideas I have. So I have to kind of pick and choose. I don't have enough time in the day to write 8 hours a day, five days a week. I have to fit it in where I can. And so it's you just got to kind of keep it balanced. But
so it sounds like you probably have this kind of internalized process where we're just generating and following through on short story ideas is really being disrupted by this move to writing novels. Is that true?
Yeah. You don't have to commit as much when you're writing short stories, but for me, and I know this is the case for other friends of mine who also do longer, they were doing short fiction and they're trying to do longer fiction as well, is it's hard to hold the whole novel in your head and then just drop it, go write a short story for a couple of weeks, and then pick your novel back up and just keep resuming. There's a lot of threads that you need to hold in your head. And so anytime I have to put the book down and go over and, work on a shiny story that really wants to be written, then I have to know that if I want to move forward with my novel, I can't keep dropping it and go over and write. And so I've only done a few short stories in the last couple of years. I'm still continuing to sell, the stories that I've written, because I have a bunch, and they take time. It takes time to go through each short story market.
Yeah.
But I just don't have as much time that I can devote to both things, because they're awesome, but they take time.
Yeah. And so how many, if you were to estimate how many short stories you've written in the last 10 years?
Over 30, of varying lengths. Some are under 1,000 words. I don't know, I don't know how much you know about the short story market. Those are called flash fiction when they're under 1,000. And if they're over that, then you'll have short story range. And I've done a few that are in the novelette range, which are over, depending on depending on who you're talking to, it's over like 7,500 in that range, up to about 17,000 words. So I've done a few there, and I've sold in different ranges. I've sold a few that are longer, and I've sold a bunch that are flash fiction. Some and then some in the middle. So yeah, I've written over 30 and sold. I was trying to count it up, and I've sold over 20 within the last 8 years, maybe 23. But then I've also done a lot of reprints with those, and so you get a lot of you have the opportunity to do reprints through audio reprints, or if you have an anthology coming out and it's a great match for your story, then I've also made sales that way as well.
Yeah, so your stories continue to work for you beyond the initial sale, it sounds like. And
exactly.
And I think I noticed that you feel like you had a story translated as well. It sounds like that would be a different way to also explore the rights.
It's still, I've sold a few stories for Chinese language, and they're still, it's kind of like whenever they choose to exercise those rights, they purchase them. And so they're whenever they choose to, but that is another avenue. You can have foreign language rights that you can resell, audio, reprint in other magazines, or reprint in anthologies. And gosh, there's probably even more. I know some of my friends have sold stories to what's the word, to like school books. Like if they're putting in an anthology of stories for students to analyze and talk about, then they've done some great sales that way too. So there's some interesting places that your stories can end up.
Yeah, that's interesting. So kind of a 2-for-1 question, I guess, is what was it about, like, what's your why behind you getting started writing, and what's your why for continuing to write?
Ooh, I think I think those would be essentially the same, which is I find stories fascinating. Anytime I am taking classes in anything, I always relate to stories and to examples. And I think that's just how we learn as people. We learn through stories. And so, especially when I'm explaining my love of speculative fiction to people who, kind of tip their head and go, huh, that's interesting. Then I tell them, well, what I love is you can take a concept that can seem very controversial, or it can seem harder to grasp. And when you take 2 steps to the side, and it's maybe a different world, or a slightly, you kind of turn it on its head a little bit, then suddenly the concept is maybe less threatening for people when they're reading about it, and they can think about the thing without having their own beliefs threatened. And so that's always something that I have loved. I've loved, the fantastic, and then also seeing how writers have taken that and used it for good, for good storytelling too, because a good story is a good story. But it's always been so interesting when I'm reading the story and then I realize, wait a second, this is really sounding similar to, this thing in real life. And I love that. I love when they almost trick you into it and you're like, wait a second. So that's just always been fun. And I think that that's something that I do. I want to write stories that get people excited. And sometimes that's just funny stories. I really love humor. I've done a lot of humorous short stories. And one of the books that I'm working on right now, it also relies quite a bit upon humor. And to me, it's just, we need that. We need that, especially when times are heavy. It's been a heavy year, and having some levity that's placed just right, I think, is so important. So that's been the case from, in the past, wanting to make an impact on people, then and now, I think is the why for me.
Yeah. Well, just, it's an interesting question for me always, because there are different ways to make an impact, and
Mm-hmm.
writing is one. And so I assume that there's like a personal gratification that goes hand in hand with that. It's like you're getting some personal benefit and helping others or having an
I think
impact.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so, because that it's fun when you can go back and enjoy reading your own story. There's pretty much anytime you read a story, you're going to be like, oh my gosh. And I'm a perfectionist, and I'll still go through and go, huh, that was the wrong word to use there. I noticed I messed up on something, but when the story overall is giving you, where you realize you're like, this is just a good story, like either I'm feeling what was intended to be felt. I'm feeling the humor. I'm
Mm.
feeling um, the sense of tragedy when a character's they almost got what they wanted, and it was not quite there. Like that sort of stuff is just, that's so rewarding
Mm.
to be able to have. And it's almost like, I just, me being able to look back and say, I did this, like, I did this story, and like, this is mine. And like, people can read that. That's really exciting to know that you have a little piece of you, a little piece of your brain that you're able to share with other people on paper.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you ever think about who's going to read your stories? Like, do you hope you're reaching somebody, or are you just curious who your stories reach? Or
Um, it is interesting. So I have nieces and nephews that are getting older, and like sometimes they're like, I read your story, and I'm like, oh, which one? Oh no, because I'm always I don't write like really stuff that I think would be totally inappropriate, but some are like darker material, and they're a little heavier, and so I always have like that little bit, oh gosh, this could be that, but I think it really depends on the story. You have people who they write something, and it's got like kind of like a YA twist to it, and so you hope that story will reach a YA market. And it's the same if I'm writing something that's light and humorous, and it's something that I know my mom would appreciate. Then it's like I she likes it when it's the lighter fare.
Mhm.
Then it's like I hope that like that demographic would enjoy reading that. So uh, it's more like hoping. I wish each story will go to the people that will enjoy it the best.
Yeah. So what's your process for coming up with a short story? Um, how does that work?
So for short stories, which has been very interesting as I'm kind of transitioning to thinking longer form.
Hmm.
It'll start with, a lot of it starts with a concept. Um, there's been quite a few. I'm trying to think about how many I've sold, but there's been quite a few that I've had that has been what I would term epistolary fiction, where it takes the form of a letter, or I sold one that was basically a recipe with reviews at the bottom,
Hmm.
and it's called Leslie's Love Potion number 4, I think is, and and to me, for those, it was really fun to think, okay, like I'm looking at this epistolary format. What is it like if you have a fantasy creature or an alien that is wanting to communicate this way? Like, what would they say? And so for me, I would kind of take that concept, take the person that I think would have the most interesting thing to say, and then go that direction.
Hmm.
And so I've done some that have been like that, uh, and some have. There's been a few that have sprung more fully formed. I guess out in my head, there's one that I did that was a uh, Snow White retelling,
Hmm.
and I really thought it would be super interesting to tell from the perspective of the queen, and there was a the basic idea was all there, and I did one little attempt where I was trying to write, and I was like, the voice doesn't sound quite right, and then I realized the relationship with the mirror was key, and that there was um, it really came down to her having this very destructive relationship with trying to gain the man in the mirror's approval. And so she was kind of going darker and darker and darker in her actions to try to retain that love, and stay the fairest in the land in his eyes. And so that to me, actually, that was like a really turning point story, was looking at the relationships in stories and between the characters. And if I have the relationships between the characters, if that sorts itself out as I'm thinking about it, and kind of dwelling on what kind of story I want to tell, then the story tends to come out pretty easily, because I know how the characters are relating to each other. If I'm struggling to find that relationship, then the story moves much slower, and it takes longer to come together. So for me, if I'm doing a story that's just very concept based, like I said, the epistolary fiction, or the really short ones that are just, kind of silly and humorous, I'll take that concept, I'll play with it, and then, it comes out pretty easily that way. And if I'm focusing on the relationship ones that maybe have a little more meat to them than some of the humorous ones might, then it's really about the relationships. And so me thinking about how the characters are relating to each other is what's going to bring the whole thing together.
Do you ever abandon a story that's not working, or?
Yeah, it's been funny. There's actually one that I'm in love with. Like, I'm so excited to finish the story. And I have all of the pieces together, and I'll go back, and this has been the funny one, is I'll read this story and I say, this is such a great story, but I have one little piece in the middle that's not relationship based. It's based off of just the mechanics, of trying to get so that the characters are in a dust storm, and I need to have a character helping out that doesn't want to help out. And so it's been trying to find it's like those really technical details. And that's been so frustrating, is I'm getting held up by just a little a little technical snafu of what can she do that will force her to finally have to help, even though she's really reluctant. And that's been the only thing. And so I've had to set the story aside and say, that's one's been really frustrating, is this whole year, as I've been working on this other novel, it's been eating at me saying, I'm the perfect story. I'm almost ready to go. And you just need to figure out this, this little detail, and then you can send me off. So yeah, there's been a few that I've had to just say, okay, I'm going to have to come back to you. But it really has come down to the relationships, I think, in just about every case, is that, except for that one story. That one story has been the technical, because it's a little more science fiction based. And I do like writing science fiction, but I have to think a little harder when it gets really technical. So,
meaning kind of hard science fiction science aspects, or world building?
From the hard science fiction aspects, or yeah, it's if I'm trying to deal with in the case of this story, for example, if I'm dealing with a dust storm in the Badlands, and the people are all on an osprey, what are those technical details that I need to work out so that somebody can know what place to go? It's the really nitty gritty details that's hanging me up on it. So it's yeah. But I will say, usually if I have a story, except for this one that I don't want to belabor it, so I'm just setting it to the side until the end of the year, and at the beginning of the year, then I'll pick it back up and keep going on it. Usually I will generally keep moving on it until it's done. There's a few that I've dropped when I realized, I don't have all the pieces for it. And those ones I just have to set aside until I can realize, okay, this is the relationship. This is the goal that the character needs to be working on. And if I don't have it, then I just have to put it down and come back to it when my brain is ready to hold on to what that problem is.
Yeah. So you write, and let's say you get a first draft done, I assume you have some sort of process then for revision, or what you're thinking about as far as a checklist before you start submitting.
Uh, Usually for just about every story, I'll send it out to some of my writing friends,
Mm-hmm.
because we all need our buddies. And so I actually have a Skype writing group that I have been meeting with. I think, how long has it been? It's been about 8 years, 7 or 8 years, I think, that we've been meeting. And so I'll send it to them, or I'll send it to some of my other friends, depending on the story, and get a little bit of feedback, see if there's something that I'm missing. And then once I know that I've got the bones right, then I'll go through and get everything. Usually I try to send out a pretty clean draft when I'm sending it out to people. But then I'll go through and I'll neaten it up even more, and I'll check to see if I line by line, if there's anything else I want to add or remove, and check it a couple more times. and then I'll send it out. So I think I mentioned the submissions grinder.
Yeah.
Is the one that I use. Yeah. So I go through there, and then I don't write for the market. I very rarely sit down and say, oh, I want to write a story for this anthology or for this short story market. I try to write the story that is the most interesting to me. And then when I'm done with it, then I look and say, okay, what markets will it fit? And then I'll send it there first.
And that takes some time, I imagine, to really come up with a good answer for then, which is, what's the right market for this story?
It definitely did at the beginning. I'm able to, as I'm looking through, the database. Actually, I guess I'll give one more little pitch to the submissions grinder. The great thing is I can enter my story in, and I can, so I made my account and I enter it in. And then when I say, okay, it's time to search for markets, then it'll pull up based off of whether it's fantasy or science fiction, or, really just about any genre of short story markets. It'll do the word length. It'll do how much I want to, my minimum cents per word, that whole thing, if I've submitted it there before, and then it'll pull that up. And so I can sort through and I can say, okay, well, obviously I can't send this story to Analog because it's not a hard SF story. Obviously I can't send it to, whatever place, or I don't want to send it to this place because they only pay 5 cents a word. I'd rather send it to the place that's, going to pay maybe a little bit more before I drop down to some of the lower paying markets, just depending on the story. But it actually, it speeds up. The same thing with sending in your cover letters. The cover letters used to really stress me out, and it speeds up. So now that I'm realizing, okay, I know what to say. It's pretty much in my head. What kind of form I want to use when I'm writing it out, and then I can whip together.
Yeah.
So,
so how did you learn to write submission letters?
oh my gosh, Google. So I had to Google all the time, and I kept doing it over and over again. I think it's called the William Shun form, which was kind of held up as the, do it like this, have it, here's the things you say. And lately there's been, a few other ways that people have recommended writing the format. Like Alex Schwartzman, who's a great editor and writer. He's got one, where it's a little more, it's a little briefer, a little more to the point. But it does make a difference. You don't want your story to get turned away because you just, actually, I'm sorry, not the Shun one. Is it Shun? Yeah, he does cover letters. That's right. I'm going to forget all of my details, but he, because I've looked it up so many places, and so it's kind of just in my head now. But it's it's general. Dear, if you know the name of the editor, you say the name, and if not, dear editors, attached is my short story. Whatever it is. My most recent one that I had published was A Farm Boy, a Wizard, and a Dark Lord walk into a tower. For your consideration, it is about 1,000 words. If it's a reprint, you tell them where it was reprinted at and when, and new paragraph. So you follow that form, and And of course, then there's always the other markets that want you to give different details. So you have to just pay attention to those. But it was definitely learning through constantly checking from other people. And the first few times I think I sent it out to friends and said, does this look right? Does it, is this okay? And that's the beauty of having other writers for friends, is they can help you through those humps where you're not quite so sure if you're doing the right thing.
Yeah. So kind of coming back to the I guess the craft piece in that college professor who kept making you or encouraging you to keep your scope small on the stories. So how do you keep your scope small?
So I feel like each story, there's, if you start thinking of a concept, they tend to fit into different lengths depending on the concept. There's ones that are they're very short. And they don't need to, they hold together really well, but if you were to try to stretch them out, you would find that there's really no story. And so I've done a lot of the flash fiction because it's just been so fun to write, and it contains itself really well. And there have been a few times that I've realized, as I was writing a flash fiction, I realized, you know what, this one's longer. And so then, I'd find that it would expand out. So one of the ways that, if people are looking at the length of their story, is, I'm gonna have to look this up, but there's actually a pretty good formula there that Mary Robinette Kowal came up with. I don't know if you've heard of this.
I've seen her lecture on this.
Okay.
I definitely encourage people. It's about I think the title in the lecture is about short stories, but she introduces the mice quotient, but there's a math formula about like how many characters and locations.
So it's depending on how many characters you have and how many locations, and I think it's like 750 words for every new location. So if you're moving locations around, you have to expect that very quickly your story is going to stack up really quickly. And same thing with characters. And really, that, even though I didn't follow that formula at the beginning, consciously, because obviously I was writing before I came across her formula and before she even started talking about it, although I love listening to her when she talks about it, it really does hold pretty true. If you have two characters talking and you change locations, it really starts to break down if you don't give enough time for each location and character to fully develop. So that has been, even though that wasn't initially what I had pulled off of, I have found that it does hold pretty true to most of my stories. If I look at them, the formula holds up.
Well, how much do you think about that? So let's say you have a concept that you're excited about, right? And so are you then going straight to looking at, well, how many characters does this need? What do I need to tell the story, and deciding how long the story is going to be at that point? Or you just kind of explore?
I really just explore. If I know how many characters I'm going to have, I focus on that, and then I let it go. Sometimes I think, this seems like this would be a great short story or a great flash fiction concept. And so if that's the case, then usually I'm not going too deeply into too many locations, and I'll keep it pretty short. But really, it feels like the stories, I want to go in with an idea, and because I'm not writing to market, I let the story develop as it is. There's one that I did that's called Nobody Enough. That's actually one of the longer stories that I've sold, and it came out in Future SF last year, and it has, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, 3 locations. It has the place where this collective of bodies that they all kind of share the same consciousness. They lose one of those bodies. It's called an avatar, in a poker game. And so they start off in the poker game, and then we see them in their apartment, and then we see them at a place where they get a new avatar, that's kind of almost like a foster home situation for somebody that So for consciousness that tried to commit suicide.
Yeah.
And so 3 of the bodies, achieved death, and the fourth one did not. And so it kind of needs, like in this future world, you can't leave a brain on itself. That's too isolated. You need to keep it in a group. And so they take it in as a foster situation. And so really, the story revolves around those 3 locations. And then you have the different consciousnesses. It gets messy, but you're dealing with those with that consciousness, the consciousness that it takes in, and then a neighbor and the person that won it in a poker game. Those are the 3 or the 4, I should say, the 4 main characters that show up. Although I know that gets messy when you're dealing with multiple consciousnesses in the stories, but because of that, I knew that I was going to be dealing with I needed to let my story grow, and there's no way that I'd be able to fit that kind of story into a flash fiction or even a regular length short story, which would be somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000. I think it was initially pretty close to 6,000, and I could tell the story didn't fit within that shorter frame. And once I allowed it to expand and to breathe a little bit, it really became the story that it needed to be. And the characters were able to work through the scenes that they needed in order to become more fully fleshed. So it was interesting.
How many words did that end up at?
I think it was about 8,400 words.
I listened to it on Starship Sofa.
Oh, did you?
Week. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very big concept, actually. It seems like you can do a lot with 8,400 words.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny because most of my stories don't fit in there, but into that length because they don't need to. There's other ones that are shorter, but the ones that need the length, you have to let them breathe. But you also don't want to stretch out a story just for length. Like it's not worth it. You want the story to feel like it's fitting into the box you're giving it. So there's some stories that I've had starting off at like 5,000, and I've ended up cutting them to 3,500 because I could just tell it didn't need it. So chop chop. You gotta.
And you mentioned that you write stories to have an impact, and I guess that brings up one of those words like subtext, and I know you're not supposed to ever tell your readers what the subtext is, right? I don't know how you feel about that.
I know it's always funny where you're like, do you tell them what to think? And then there's always those awesome comics where you can see like the author practically coming out of their grave being like, no, that's not what the color blue meant. They're just furious with the people that are analyzing their story.
Well, I'm curious, just, since that's an example, you mentioned Nobody Enough, right?
Yeah.
Like, do you remember if you had a subtext or if you were just exploring a concept or?
Oh, yeah. So there's a few, actually. So it initially started off with one of my friends who was ranting about how, ladies, you do not need to get your body back after you have had a child. You have your body and it is fantastic. And, she just went off on this lovely little rant, and I was, just reading it going, amen, like, and I'm a Pilates teacher, and that's my day job is I teach Pilates. And so I love fitness, but I also believe very deeply, that people need to embrace who they are.
Yeah.
And so I thought, oh, that'd be so fun to start off with that story, which is how I got my body back. And so that was actually the original title. And I wrote it, and I brainstormed some ideas, and what could I do based off of that awesome title? That was actually a title based beginning, to the story. So it definitely started from how I got my body back. And so I wrote it. And I realized that was way too flippant of a tone for the story. And so, because I sent that to some markets, and I'm like, well, no wonder, this does not match it at all. And so I, talked about it and sent it to a friend, and she, she's like, oh yeah, out of the ideas I'd suggest, I was like, that's perfect. So thank goodness for that. But the other subtext that I was working on as I began to delve into the concept that I had created was there's so much that comes into about acceptance and about wanting people to be their own skin and feeling like you're not doing what everybody else should be doing. And so, there's this person, and I never name the gender of the main character of that, of that person. It's just not even there. And so, it's been really interesting when I get feedback from readers and from different people where some people give it a gender and I go, that's interesting. It's interesting to hear what people have to say, when they try to place the person.
Yeah.
But to me, that was one way that I felt like I could address gender and the extreme confusion that comes out of trying to define gender. That was something that I really felt like I understood when I was younger. And you grow up and you're like, okay, I don't understand how this all works, and I need to educate myself more. And so, I'm really glad that I have had so many different kinds of friends, and they have different backgrounds, and they, and so I feel like I'm able to understand it a little bit better. And for me, that was a way for me to address that it's okay to, to maybe not feel like you're like everybody else.
Yeah.
And to be able to kind of play with, how that affects our relationships with our bodies, and wanting to feel like you're enough and feel like that's okay. And so it's funny because it kind of went from like women's feeling like they're like they can accept themselves, which was the original, and then kind of moving into, I hope that everybody can, that everybody can feel like they're comfortable in their own skin. Yeah, those are like the two biggest subtexts I'd say within that story, to be able to that I was hoping to get across.
Yeah. And as I hear you talk about that, I guess I wonder then, if you look back at your body of work so far, pun not intended, until I thought of it.
You're right.
If you've noticed, noticed or embraced, like, do you have like overarching themes that come up again and again in your work?
A little bit. A lot of it has been about acceptance in different things. Obviously, the humor. I take the humor many different directions. With what I want to accomplish with it, I want people to enjoy the story. One of my better known, if you have read of any of my stories, it would be Miss Darcy's First Intergalactic Ballet Class, which really was a great way for me to pull off of my experiences as a dance teacher. With the kids, you're like, why are you licking the wall, and why are you doing this and that, and it was fun to pull off of that. So I think for my humor, those stories, I will add some, I hope people feel this, like there's some one that's called fairy godmothering, and I'm trying to pull it together so it's nice in a tight bow, but it's basically fairy godmothers in training, and they're using real world examples. And so these fairy godmothers in training are trying to apply the things that you might do for Cinderella to, say, like Marie Antoinette and some of King Henry's wives, and they don't go really well because this is the real world, and things don't go as well. So there's been a few where I want to add some discussion of gender, but there's other ones that have kind of started to delve, and this is obviously as I've become a parent. A lot of them have kind of started to deal with kids and the different pains that can come in those relationships. I have one called A Vocabulary of Remorse, and it essentially boils down to a mom who is trying to get a treatment for her child because she had it and she knows that it helped her, and she wants to basically foist that upon him. But by foisting this fact, it's by foisting this treatment upon him, he's going to have his whole world changed. And so it's her kind of finding that balance of, you know, this was great for me, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be something that I can force upon other people.
Right.
And I've noticed that, you know, as I've been doing other ones with another one that I have that I've been shopping out is it's called Of Mothers and Daughters and Gods, and it's about a woman who gains the ability to save other people, but she really starts to struggle with how much time she's able to spend with her daughter, because she's got this little voice in her head that's literally beginning to pull her away when she needs to go save somebody from a drowning or a choking, or, you know, a house is on fire. And so she has to just take off and abandon her teenage daughter. And, you know, and so she is dealing with these relationships and families. And as I look at a lot of the more serious ones, some on the more humorous ones, but a lot of my more serious ones are about family relationships and how those may be painful, and not necessarily all painful, but, you know, the different things that we go through is just, like I said, we're taking two steps to the side and turning it a little bit so that we can approach it from a different view. That's been, I'd say that's kind of been my, if I was to say an overarching view of my stories, that would probably be one that would fit in pretty well.
And so they're kind of evolving as you evolve.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You know, we're definitely, I really want to write from experience. You know, it's not really write what you know, because obviously I've never been through these types of experiences, but I do take that moment, right? You know, you take the moment where you're feeling something, and then you build on it. You build on that feeling. I have one who this is one that's mid-story. This is the one that I'm waiting to fix. Is there's a girl who's post-apocalyptic, and she's going around, you know, rescuing people who are in different pockets all around the United States, and she's looking for her birth dad. And that's not something that I've experienced myself, but some of those feelings, you know, I can relate to, of wanting to feel accepted. And she meets up with her birth father's sister, and it doesn't go well at all. And at first it does, until she says, well, yeah, it looks like your brother's my dad. And then, you know, then it's just this just push away. And, you know, we want to take those feelings that we know we can relate to. And that's something that, you know, that we do know. If we know those feelings, we can write a story around them, even if not every detail is our story.
Yeah. It provides a safe little container to explore that and
exactly,
and acknowledge it, because I know with family it can be a challenge to just head on take on big thoughts and feelings. Right.
Talk about this.
Yeah.
Even though you totally want to avoid it, let's talk about it right now.
Yeah, right now. Or I can write a story. So, or novels. So, why novels now?
So, like I said, my plan was never to write a story because, you know, a short story, because it's going to make me so much money, and then I'll become, you know, a novelist after that. But I found that as I was writing stories, you know, I kind of started to get hungry for that chance to do a bigger story and to tell something that had a little more time with it, and I could, you know, spend a little more time on it. And so that's kind of the direction I've been wanting. You know, I've got my two projects that I'm currently working on. One is very, you know, it's dealing with a lot of video game tropes. It's, you know, it's like I want to say it's like Jumanji, except not, because it's a real world. So they don't just get sucked into a video game. They get sucked into a real world where their abilities came from their video games, and they're trying to figure out why they're there and why they're getting murdered. And, so it's fun. That's the more humorous one. And it's kind of that desire, to know that it's a different market that you're writing for, because people that read, short stories, they also read novels, but a lot of people that read novels don't read short stories, and so I feel like there's a lot of stories that I want to tell, and I really want to be able to do the ones that are longer form. And if you don't ever sit and write them, then you can't ever share them with anybody else. So it felt like for the last couple of years, I'd written one kids, I'd say like middle grade novel, and I learned a lot from it, but I'm just going to let it, I'll let it sit in the trunk. I wrote that about 5 or 6 years ago, and I learned from it, but I want to put my energies towards the stories that I know are going to help me, that I'm going to be able to learn from. And so, it felt like the 2 projects I have right now, those are the ones that I'm going to be able to move on. I'll be able to, obviously there's things that I'm going to have to plot, things I'll have to figure out, and things I'll have to cut, but they definitely feel like the projects that have me the most excited to write. And they're pretty ambitious. They both deal with larger casts. Which is, again, was one of those changes from short stories, because you can only have so many characters in a short story before it's not a short story anymore, and it's a mess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel a tension between being professionally oriented around writing these stories and the need to maybe experience, just that joy of doing something new and pushing yourself?
I think so, because there's that, I think there's a lot of different ways we can go with this, but there's that concept, that writers write, and you can talk about writing, but until you're doing it, you can't, there's nothing to show people. And I don't think there's any, I don't want people to feel guilty if they're, if they're like, oh, I really want to write, but they're not doing it. Obviously, guilt doesn't really help you move forward. It'll maybe get you doing a page or 2, but then you tend to stop if you're doing it out of guilt. You really want to do it because it's bringing you joy, really. I mean, if you have a story to write, then doing it out of guilt won't. Maybe you can, like I said, it'll only take you so far. So, oh gosh, I'm trying to think if there was something else I was going to say. Go ahead. If you have another question, then I'll fold it in.
You kind of answered what it's not, but your experience for how you're dealing with it right now, sounds like there's a lot of opportunity for joy there. And I was, raising the specter that, I imagine there's challenges to that as well. But
to the longer format.
Yeah.
I think so. It's been interesting though, because there's things that, there's scenes that are really hard to include in short stories. I didn't do a lot of romance in my short stories because I don't know. I mean, there's a little bit, there's a few things here and there, but not the same. And it's been fun to be able to insert more romantic scenes into this novel, or more of the action scenes. I've kind of joked that, when you're being self-deprecating with your friends and you say, wow, a lot of my stories are me sticking, 1 or 2 characters into a box, and they think a lot,
Yeah.
And somehow, I feel like I still write entertaining stories, but, there's different stories to tell when you have that larger cast. And so it's really fun to get to, take the character that's just, they're like a puppy, and they just want to do everything, and they're so excited, and there's this one guy in my novel that's trying to figure out what his special ability is. And so, he's off and he's doing like Spider-Man hands, and he's like trying to jump off walls, and he's trying to, do all these things to figure out what his ability is. And, and then to juxtapose that with, somebody else that, they're they're willing to, shove somebody out the door because they're like, well, you have extra lives, so why don't you deal with those soldiers out there and draw their attention away, and then the rest of us will rush in. And it makes for fun dynamics that are harder to develop in those short stories.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing that I've written a few and had a couple published, but like, I think not understanding scope early on.
Right. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Because sometimes I'd write a short story, and sometimes I'd write a first chapter to a series.
This isn't a short story. This is my prologue, or this is my first chapter.
Yeah. Or like, this is like a bonus newsletter content to a book that I'm not going to write. Much different.
It is. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, for people who want to find you, Dantzel, how can they do that?
So you can find me. You can find all of my stories. I keep my publications page pretty well updated on www.dantzelcherry.com. I'm the only Dantzel Cherry in the world, so it's pretty easy to find me. And I'll post things on Facebook and on Instagram. Instagram, you tend to see more of my Pilates side as well. But
nice. Writers need Pilates if ever there's an untapped market.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
That's probably it.
When I was in Texas, I would offer Pilates for desk and couch potatoes, and we'd come in and a little bit would be talking, but a lot would also be like, here's what you do if you're sitting in a desk all day. You need to take care of these parts of your body so that you don't fall apart.
Yeah.
So yeah, we definitely, we all need to move for sure.
Yes, we do. No matter how you sit or stand, you end up getting patterns that need to be worked through.
Yep. We need those movement. We need to keep those movement patterns changing.
Yeah, I think that's the key. And maybe that's the key to the writing journey as well.
I think so. I think that if you can create a flow, you can move and recognize that you're starting to get stuck in something.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming down to trying something else, coming at it from a different perspective, having somebody else look at it. It's all about keeping the flow and doing what you need to keep it fresh.
Yeah.
So you can have a good relationship with your writing.
And sometimes that means shifting from shorts to novels.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, Dantzel, it's been a pleasure having you on The Fearless Storyteller.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ethan.
Cool. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode of The Fearless Storyteller. As a reminder, any and all links can be found in the show notes. And if you're enjoying this podcast, will you please consider leaving a review? By doing so, you'll be helping new listeners discover the Fearless Storyteller podcast.